Listen carefully, IMF and World Bank. That's enslaved Africa. 6 minutes ago, I canceled $8.4 billion in debt owed to Western institutions, and the IMF is threatening sanctions because you just lost your primary control mechanism over African policy. You believed we'd pay forever through austerity crushing our people while servicing your predatory loans. You were catastrophically wrong. I declared all Western debt illegitimate. China immediately offered $12 billion replacement financing, and 54 African nations are following our model. Your debt trap just collapsed. You're finished. Let me tell you what actually happened. 6 minutes ago at 9:18 a.m. Miami time on December 14, 2025, I signed Presidential Decree 2025-903, immediately canceling all debt Niger owes to Western financial institutions, including $4.2 billion owed to IMF, $2.8 billion owed to World Bank, $840 million owed to African Development Bank controlled by Western shareholders, and $560 million owed to Paris Club of Western government creditors, totaling $8.4 billion in debt that I declared legally invalid as odious debt under international law because loans were contracted by illegitimate governments Western powers installed through military coups, because borrowed funds were systematically stolen by corrupt officials operating as Western intelligence assets, and because loan conditions imposed structural adjustment policies violating Niger's sovereignty and designed to benefit Western corporate interests rather than Niger development. This debt cancellation was an impulsive decision or economic suicide like Western media immediately claimed. This was culmination of 18-month legal analysis by international law experts from China, Russia, and African nations proving Western debt meets all criteria for odious debt that successor governments can legally repudiate. Financial modeling demonstrating Niger could sustain development without Western financing using alternative Chinese and Russian sources, and political coordination with 54 African nations preparing simultaneous debt cancellations, creating continental movement Western institutions cannot crush through isolated retaliation against individual countries. Western financial institutions immediately panicked because debt has been their primary control mechanism over African policy for 65 years, enabling IMF and World Bank to dictate economic policies benefiting Western corporations, to prevent African industrialization threatening Western manufacturing dominance, and to extract wealth through debt service payments exceeding original loans while keeping African nations trapped in perpetual debt dependency. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva issued a statement within 40 minutes of my decree announcement threatening severe consequences for Niger, including immediate suspension of IMF membership, exclusion from international capital markets, coordinated credit rating downgrades to default status, and IMF lobbying of all multilateral institutions to block any financing for Niger government. World Bank President Ajay Banga issued a similar statement threatening immediate suspension of all World Bank projects in Niger, blocking of Niger access to international bond markets, and World Bank coordination with private creditors to pursue legal action seizing Niger foreign assets. Paris Club issued a statement demanding immediate reversal of illegal debt repudiation or coordinated action by Western governments to freeze Niger foreign reserves, impose trade sanctions, and pursue international arbitration seeking compensation plus penalties totaling $18 billion. These Western threats revealed their absolute panic because they recognize Niger's debt cancellation threatens the entire system of Western financial control over Africa that extracted $1.84 trillion from African nations between 1980-2025 while keeping Africa trapped in debt despite paying back more than double what was borrowed. But Western threats were empty because China responded within 2 hours with overwhelming support, making Western financial isolation completely impossible. China's foreign ministry spokesman issued statement at 11:47 a.m. Beijing time, exactly 127 minutes after my decree, expressing complete support for Niger's sovereign right to review and repudiate odious debt contracted by illegitimate governments, applauding Niger's courage challenging unjust international financial architecture that has impoverished developing nations through predatory lending. More importantly, Chinese finance minister announced China Development Bank was immediately offering Niger $12 billion comprehensive financing package at 1.8% annual interest rate with 25-year repayment period, including 5-year grace period, financing exceeding canceled $8.4 billion debt by $3.6 billion, provided at interest rate 1/5 of 8 to 12% average Western loans charged, and offered without any political conditions or structural adjustment requirements that characterized Western lending. Chinese finance minister explicitly stated, China respects Niger's sovereignty and imposes no conditions on financing beyond standard commercial terms for repayment. Niger will determine its own economic policies. Niger will prioritize Niger development rather than Western corporate interests. And China will never use debt as tool for political control or policy interference, unlike Western institutions whose lending always serves Western geopolitical and economic interests rather than borrower development. This immediate Chinese financing offer exceeding canceled debt by $3.6 billion and provided at one-fifth Western interest rates without political conditions completely destroyed Western threats to exclude Niger from international financing. Niger wouldn't face any financing constraints from Western exclusion because Chinese financing exceeded our needs. Chinese terms were vastly superior to Western loans, and Chinese respect for sovereignty meant we could pursue development policies advancing Niger interests rather than implementing structural adjustment benefiting Western corporations. Within 6 hours of Chinese announcement, Russia's finance ministry added $4.8 billion additional financing offer for specific infrastructure projects at 2.1% interest, and Arab Development Bank offered $2.4 billion financing at 2.8% interest, meaning Niger had total $19.2 billion in alternative financing available within 6 hours of canceling $8.4 billion Western debt, proving definitively that Western financial institutions were no longer gatekeepers controlling developing nations' access to capital. Let me explain exactly how Western financial institutions enslaved Africa through debt for 65 years, extracting $1.84 trillion in debt service while keeping African nations trapped in perpetual debt despite paying back more than double borrowed amounts. Western debt trap began immediately after African independence in 1960s, when former colonial powers and international financial institutions, controlled by Western governments, offered newly independent African nations loans for development projects. These initial loans appeared beneficial. African nations needed capital for infrastructure, Western institutions offered financing, and loan terms seemed reasonable with 5 to 8% interest rates common for development lending. But Western lending strategy was deliberately designed as debt trap, ensuring African nations would never escape debt dependency regardless of repayment amounts. First mechanism of debt trap was lending to corrupt dictators Western powers installed through coups and supported despite massive theft. Between 1960 and 1990, IMF and World Bank lent $240 billion to African governments, with $84 billion, representing 35% of total lending, going to dictatorships including Mobutu's Zaire, Abacha's Nigeria, Eyadema's Togo, Bongo's Gabon, and Biya's Cameroon that Western intelligence agencies knew were systematically stealing loan funds. Mobutu Sese Seko ruled Zaire from 1965-1997, receiving $12 billion in Western loans while accumulating personal fortune of $8 billion stolen from loan funds and deposited in Swiss and Belgian banks, meaning 2/3 of loans to Zaire were stolen by dictator rather than used for development. Western creditors knew Mobutu was stealing because CIA had detailed intelligence on his theft, because Swiss banks reported his deposits to Western intelligence, and because World Bank's own audits documented that projects financed by loans to Zaire were never built or cost fraction of loan amounts. Despite knowing Mobutu stole systematically, Western institutions continued lending because Mobutu served Western interests by preventing Soviet influence, by granting Western corporations favorable mining contracts for Congolese copper and cobalt, and by supporting Western positions in international forums. When Mobutu was finally overthrown in 1997, Western creditors demanded Congo's successor government continue servicing debt contracted by Mobutu, despite successor government receiving zero benefit from stolen funds, arguing that sovereign debt obligations continue regardless of whether borrowed funds were stolen by previous corrupt leadership. This pattern repeated across dozens of African nations where Western institutions lent hundreds of billions to corrupt dictators. Western intelligence recruited as assets, where loan funds were systematically stolen and deposited in Western banks, and where Western creditors then demanded successor democratic governments continue servicing debt, despite receiving no benefit from loans. Under international law doctrine of odious debt established through legal scholarship and state practice, debt contracted by illegitimate governments that doesn't benefit population and where creditors knew of illegitimacy can be legally repudiated by successor governments without violating international obligations. Western creditors deliberately ignore odious debt doctrine because recognizing it would require canceling hundreds of billions in African debt contracted by Western-installed dictators who stole loan funds with Western knowledge and complicity. Second mechanism of debt trap was imposing loan conditions requiring structural adjustment policies benefiting Western corporations rather than African development. Beginning in 1980s, when many African nations faced debt service difficulties due to global recession and commodity price collapses, IMF and World Bank offered refinancing and additional loans conditional on implementing structural adjustment programs requiring privatization of state-owned enterprises, selling them to Western corporations at below-market prices, elimination of trade barriers enabling Western manufactured goods flooding African markets, destroying domestic industries, removal of capital controls enabling Western corporations repatriating all profits rather than reinvesting locally, elimination of food and fuel subsidies benefiting poor populations, reduction of government spending on healthcare and education, and currency devaluations making African exports cheaper for Western buyers while making Western imports more expensive for African consumers. These structural adjustment conditions were presented as necessary economic reforms promoting efficiency and growth, but actual results across 40 years proved structural adjustment systematically impoverished African nations while benefiting Western corporations. Privatization requirements forced African governments selling profitable state enterprises to Western corporations at fraction of actual value. Nigeria was forced privatizing telecommunications company worth $8.4 billion, selling it to British consortium for $2.1 billion, 25% of actual value, with sale proceeds used for debt service rather than development investment. Ghana was forced privatizing electricity distribution, selling it to American Corporation for $420 million, when independent valuation showed $1.8 billion value. Zambia was forced privatizing copper mines, selling them to British and Canadian corporations for $340 million, when copper reserves were worth $12 billion. These privatizations transferred African assets worth hundreds of billions to Western corporations at criminally low prices, eliminated good-paying public sector jobs, and transferred control over strategic industries from African governments to Western corporations that extracted profits rather than reinvesting in African development. Trade barrier elimination destroyed African manufacturing industries unable to compete with Western manufactured goods, benefiting from centuries of industrial development and massive economies of scale. Tanzania's textile industry employed 42,000 workers in 1980 producing clothing for domestic market protected by tariffs limiting clothing imports. Structural adjustment required eliminating tariffs, enabling Chinese and Western used clothing flooding Tanzanian market at prices local manufacturers couldn't match. By 2000, Tanzania's textile industry collapsed with 38,000 job losses and textile production falling 84%. This pattern repeated across every African nation forced implementing structural adjustment. Domestic industries were destroyed by import competition. Hundreds of thousands lost manufacturing jobs. African nations became permanent importers of manufactured goods rather than developing own industrial capacity, and Western corporations captured African consumer markets without competition from domestic industries. Subsidy elimination and spending cuts devastated poor populations and reduced human capital development. Niger was forced eliminating food subsidies in 1985 as structural adjustment condition, causing food prices increasing 340% within 2 years and malnutrition rates increasing from 18% to 42% of children under 5. Zambia was forced reducing healthcare spending 48% between 1990 and 1995, causing infant mortality increasing from 84 to 112 per 1,000 births as clinics closed and medicine supplies depleted. Kenya was forced reducing education spending 38% between 1988 and 1993, causing primary school enrollment falling from 87% to 62% as school fees were imposed and thousands of teachers were laid off. These spending cuts and subsidy eliminations killed hundreds of thousands through increased malnutrition, preventable diseases, and reduced healthcare access, while also reducing African human capital development through lower education access, benefiting Western creditors who received continued debt service payments while African populations suffered and died. Third mechanism of debt trap was currency devaluation clauses and interest rate structures ensuring debt burdens increased regardless of repayment amounts. Many African loans were denominated in dollars or euros rather than local currencies, with repayment amounts calculated at current exchange rates. When structural adjustment policies caused African currency devaluations, often 60–80% declines in currency values between 1980 and 2000, dollar-denominated debt burdens increased proportionally, even though African governments hadn't borrowed additional amounts. Niger borrowed $420 million from World Bank in 1985 when exchange rate was 250 CFA francs per dollar, meaning debt was 105 billion CFA francs. By 1994, after structural adjustment-induced devaluation, exchange rate was 600 francs per dollar, meaning same $420 million debt was now 252 billion francs, a 140% increase in local currency debt burden despite Niger not borrowing any additional amount. This currency devaluation effect meant African nations paid back vastly more in local currency terms than they borrowed, even before accounting for interest charges. Variable interest rates on many loans meant debt service costs increased dramatically during 1980s when global interest rates rose to 14–18% due to U.S. Federal Reserve policies combating inflation. African nations that borrowed at 5–7% interest rates in 1970s suddenly faced 12–16% rates on existing loans with variable rate clauses, causing debt service payments tripling or quadrupling despite borrowing no additional amounts. These interest rate increases were completely beyond African control, determined by Western central bank policies responding to Western economic conditions, yet African nations bore full burden of increased debt service costs that consumed increasing percentages of government revenues, leaving less for development spending. Fourth mechanism of debt trap was continuous refinancing, creating perpetual debt where principal amounts never decreased despite decades of payments. When African nations couldn't meet debt service obligations due to economic crises, commodity price collapses, or structural adjustment-induced recessions, Western creditors offered refinancing packages where unpaid interest was added to principal, new loans covered old debt service, and payment schedules were extended with additional interest charges. This refinancing meant African debt principals continuously increased despite African nations making regular payments, because payments barely covered interest charges while refinancing added unpaid interest to principals, creating exponential debt growth. Sub-Saharan Africa's total external debt was $84 billion in 1980. Between 1980 and 2025, African nations paid $184 trillion in debt service, representing 2,190% of 1980 debt levels, meaning Africa paid back nearly 22 times the original debt. Yet Africa's outstanding debt in 2025 was $648 billion, representing 771% of 1980 levels, despite paying back 22 times original debt. This mathematically impossible outcome, where paying back 22 times original debt results in owing 7.7 times original amount, proves definitively that Western debt structure was designed as permanent trap, ensuring African nations would never escape debt regardless of payment amounts. Through these four mechanisms, lending to corrupt dictators and demanding successor governments service stolen funds, imposing structural adjustment, destroying African industries and killing populations through spending cuts, currency devaluation and interest rate clauses, increasing debt burdens regardless of repayment, and continuous refinancing, ensuring debt principals never decrease despite massive payments. Western financial institutions extracted $184 trillion from Africa between 1980 and 2025, while keeping African nations trapped in perpetual debt that grew from $84 billion to $648 billion, despite paying back 22 times original amount. This wasn't development finance or partnership. This was systematic wealth extraction using debt as tool for neo-colonial control over African policy and continued exploitation of African resources and markets. Niger's specific debt history exemplifies Western debt trap mechanisms perfectly. Niger gained independence 1960 with zero external debt. Between 1960 and 1985, Western institutions lent Niger $2.1 billion for development projects, including agricultural programs, transportation infrastructure, education systems, and healthcare facilities. Of this $2.1 billion borrowed, $840 million, representing 40% of total, was stolen by Niger Presidents Hamani Diori and Sani Kouché, who deposited stolen funds in Swiss and French banks with Western intelligence knowledge and complicity, because both leaders served French interests maintaining French uranium access. Another $680 million, representing 32% of total borrowed, went to projects that were never completed or provided minimal benefit because French contractors inflated costs by 240–380% above actual construction expenses, with excess payments kicked back to corrupt officials. Only $580 million, representing 28% of borrowed amounts, actually financed completed projects, providing any benefit to Niger population. Despite Niger receiving benefit from only 28% of borrowed amounts, while 72% was stolen or wasted through corruption, Western creditors enabled, Western institutions demanded Niger service full debt. Between 1985-2025, Niger paid $4.8 billion in debt service on original $2.1 billion borrowed, meaning Niger paid back 229% of original debt over 40 years. Yet Niger's outstanding Western debt in December 2025 was $8.4 billion, representing 400% of original borrowed amount despite paying back 229%. This impossible math where paying back 229% of borrowed amount results in owing 400% proves debt was designed as permanent trap. The mechanism was continuous refinancing where Niger's inability to meet debt service obligations due to low uranium royalties, French-imposed structural adjustment destroying Niger economy, and currency devaluations increasing dollar-denominated debt led to refinancing adding unpaid interest to principal and new loans covering old obligations, causing debt growing exponentially despite regular payments. Most devastatingly, debt service consumed resources Niger desperately needed for development. Between 2010 and 2025, Niger paid average $340 million annually in debt service to Western institutions, money that could have built 840 schools educating 420,000 additional children, or 180 hospitals providing healthcare to 8.4 million people, or 4,200 kilometers of roads connecting rural areas to markets, or electricity infrastructure serving 2.8 million people currently without power. Instead, this $340 million annually went to Western creditors as payment on debt, where 72% of borrowed funds were stolen by corrupt officials with Western complicity, and where Niger had already paid back 229% of original amount. This debt service burden directly caused Niger poverty because government revenues that should have financed development instead serviced illegitimate debt imposed through Western-backed corruption and designed as permanent trap through refinancing mechanisms. Debt also provided Western institutions control over Niger policy through structural adjustment conditions. Between 1986 and 2025, every refinancing agreement and new loan from IMF or World Bank included conditions requiring Niger to implement policies benefiting Western interests, privatizing state-owned enterprises, selling them to French corporations, eliminating trade barriers enabling French manufactured goods, destroying Niger domestic production, maintaining CFA franc currency controlled by French treasury rather than adopting independent Niger currency, prioritizing debt service over domestic spending, ensuring Western creditors receive payments even when Niger couldn't afford healthcare or education, and preventing Niger from renegotiating uranium contracts with France because structural adjustment required investment-friendly policies, meaning accepting exploitative arrangements rather than demanding fair terms. These structural adjustment conditions violated Niger's sovereignty by imposing policy requirements benefiting Western corporate and creditor interests rather than Niger development. But debt dependency gave Western institutions power to impose conditions because refusing meant losing refinancing and facing default that would block all international financing. My Presidential Decree 2025-903 canceling $8.4 billion in Western debt was based on detailed 240-page legal analysis prepared between March-November 2025 by international law experts from Renmin University Law School in China, Moscow State University Institute of International Law, and African law scholars from universities in South Africa, Kenya, and Senegal. Niger's Western debt qualified as odious debt under international law doctrine, permitting successor governments to repudiate debt contracted by illegitimate predecessors when borrowed funds didn't benefit population and creditors knew of illegitimacy. Legal analysis proved Niger's Western debt met all three criteria for odious debt classification. First criterion, debt contracted by illegitimate government, was clearly satisfied because $840 million of $2.1 billion borrowed between 1960 and 1985 went to Presidents Diori and Kounché, who came to power through French organized military coups rather than democratic elections, ruled as dictators without popular legitimacy, and maintained power through French military support rather than popular consent. Under international law, governments installed through foreign-backed coups lack legitimacy to bind nations to international obligations, including debt. Second criterion, borrowed funds didn't benefit population, was satisfied because 72% of borrowed amounts were stolen by corrupt officials or wasted through inflated contracts rather than financing completed projects benefiting Niger population, and because debt-financed projects that were completed provided minimal development benefit while structural adjustment conditions attached to refinancing actively harmed population through spending cuts, subsidy eliminations, and policies destroying Niger industries. Third criterion, creditor knowledge of illegitimacy, was satisfied because Western intelligence agencies had detailed documentation of corruption by Diori and Counchet, including CIA reports describing their theft, because French intelligence actively supported both dictators despite knowing they stole systematically, and because World Bank's own audit reports documented that projects financed by Niger loans were never completed or cost fractions of loan amounts, proving funds were stolen. Legal analysis concluded that under odious debt doctrine recognized by international legal scholars and applied in historical precedents including U.S. repudiation of Cuban debt after 1898 on grounds debt was contracted by Spanish colonial government not benefiting Cuban population, Niger had solid legal grounds to repudiate all debt contracted during 1960-1985 period and all subsequent refinancing of that debt. Legal analysis further argued that even debt contracted after 1985 qualified for repudiation because refinancing repeatedly added unpaid interest and fees to principals, violating customary international law principles prohibiting usury, and because structural adjustment conditions attached to post-1985 lending violated Niger's sovereignty and constituted economic coercion, invalidating debt obligations under international law principles that agreements obtained through coercion are legally void. Beyond legal justification proving Niger's Western debt qualified as odious debt under international law, my debt cancellation was based on comprehensive financial modeling demonstrating conclusively that Niger could sustain robust development without any Western financing by utilizing alternative sources offering vastly superior terms without political conditions or structural adjustment requirements that historically destroyed African economies. Financial modeling was conducted between June-October 2025 by a team of 42 economists and development planning experts from Niger Ministry of Finance, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Russian Economic Development Ministry, and African Economic Research Institutes in Kenya, South Africa, and Senegal. And modeling exercise calculated Niger's total financing needs over 10-year development period 2026-2035 at $42 billion, covering 4 critical development priorities. $18 billion for infrastructure development, including 8,400 kilometers of paved roads connecting rural areas to markets and enabling agricultural commercialization, 4,200 kilometers of railroad linking Niger to regional trade networks and reducing transportation costs by 60%, universal electricity access building 42,000 kilometers of distribution lines serving 21.7 million Nigerians currently without power, telecommunications infrastructure providing mobile and internet connectivity to 84% of population up from current 34%, and water systems delivering clean water to 18 million rural residents, $12 billion for social services expansion, including construction of 840 hospitals and 2,400 health clinics, with equipment and trained personnel reducing infant mortality from 46 to under 15 per 1,000 births, building 4,200 schools and training 28,000 additional teachers, implementing free universal education through secondary level, achieving universal literacy within 15 years, and establishing vocational training centers in 67 municipalities, providing technical skills for 420,000 youth annually, $8 billion for industrial development, including establishment of uranium processing facilities, enabling Niger to export enriched uranium at triple value of raw ore, aluminum smelting plants using Niger bauxite deposits and cheap nuclear electricity, cement production facilities supplying construction boom, agricultural processing plants adding value to cotton, livestock, and crops, and industrial zones in Niamey, Zinder, and Maradi attracting manufacturing investment, and $4 billion for agricultural modernization, including irrigation systems, enabling year-round cultivation on 2.4 million hectares currently rain-dependent, mechanization providing tractors and equipment to 84,000 farm cooperatives, improved seed and fertilizer distribution, rural credit facilities providing farmers access to capital, and agricultural research developing drought-resistant varieties suited to Sahel climate. This $42 billion total financing requirement over 10-year period 2026-2035 represented ambitious but achievable development program that would transform Niger from among world's poorest nations with $687 per capita income, 19% electricity access, 37% literacy, and 62-year life expectancy to middle-income country with projected $2,400 per capita income by 2035, 84% electricity access, 78% literacy, and 71-year life expectancy approaching global averages. Financial modeling demonstrated Niger could fully finance this transformative development program without any Western institutional lending through four alternative financing sources, providing combined $58.6 billion, exceeding $42 billion needs by $16.6 billion, and proving definitively that Niger faced absolutely no financing constraints from Western exclusion following debt cancellation. First financing source was $28 billion from Russian and Chinese development financing already committed through binding agreements signed between August 2024 and December 2025, providing guaranteed capital at 1.8–2.4% annual interest rates without any political conditions or structural adjustment requirements that characterized Western lending. Russian commitments totaled $14 billion, including $8.4 billion for nuclear power plant construction, financed through 40-year loan at 1.8% interest with 5-year grace period, $3.2 billion for transportation infrastructure, including railroad construction, linking Niger to regional networks and highway improvements connecting mining regions to ports, $1.8 billion for agricultural development, including irrigation systems and mechanization programs, and $600 million for telecommunications infrastructure building 4G mobile networks, covering 78% of population. Chinese commitments totaled $14 billion, including $4.8 billion for electricity distribution infrastructure building, 42,000 kilometers of power lines connecting rural areas to national grid and nuclear plant, $3.6 billion for industrial zone development in Niamey, Zinder, and Maradi, including factory construction, equipment provision, and infrastructure supporting manufacturing investment, $2.8 billion for water systems delivering clean water to 18 million rural residents through well construction, treatment facilities, and distribution networks, $1.4 billion for healthcare infrastructure building 840 hospitals and 2,400 clinics with medical equipment, and $1.4 billion for education infrastructure building 4,200 schools with equipment and teacher training programs. These Russian and Chinese financing commitments were formalized through detailed loan agreements, specifying exact project descriptions, disbursement schedules, interest rates averaging 2.1% across all commitments, repayment periods of 25–40 years, with 5-year grace periods before repayment begins, and explicit provisions that no political conditions or policy requirements are attached to financing beyond standard commercial terms for repayment. Borrower maintains complete sovereignty over economic policy, development strategy, and domestic political arrangements. This explicit rejection of political conditionality distinguished Russian and Chinese development financing fundamentally from Western institutional lending that always included structural adjustment requirements, mandating privatization, benefiting Western corporations, trade liberalization destroying domestic industries, austerity reducing government spending on social services, and currency policies maintaining Western corporate access to cheap resources. Russian and Chinese agreements included provisions for technical assistance where Russian and Chinese experts would advise on project implementation, but all final decisions rest with Niger government, and technical assistance constitutes advisory support rather than policy imposition. This respect for Niger sovereignty meant Niger could pursue development strategies advancing Niger interests, including maintaining state ownership of strategic industries, protecting infant industries through trade policies, investing heavily in social services, and prioritizing employment generation over pure economic efficiency, policy options that Western structural adjustment systematically prohibited. Russian and Chinese financing also focused exclusively on productive investments building infrastructure and industrial capacity that would generate economic returns enabling loan repayment, rather than Western pattern of lending for debt refinancing, budget support requiring austerity, and structural adjustment enforcement. Every dollar of Russian and Chinese financing built tangible assets, power plants generating electricity, roads moving goods to markets, factories producing manufactured goods, irrigation systems enabling agricultural production, schools educating workforce, hospitals improving health outcomes. These productive investments would generate economic growth, enabling Niger to service debt from increased tax revenues resulting from larger economy, rather than Western pattern where debt service required reducing domestic spending because Western loans didn't finance productive investments generating returns. Financial modeling projected that $28 billion Russian and Chinese infrastructure and industrial investments would generate additional $8.4 billion in annual GDP by 2035, a 46% increase over Niger's current $18.4 billion GDP, through multiple channels including $2.8 billion from industrial production in Chinese-financed industrial zones, $2.1 billion from increased agricultural output using Russian-financed irrigation and mechanization, $1.8 billion from electricity sector revenues as nuclear plant and distribution infrastructure enabled commercial and industrial customers paying for power, $1.2 billion from transportation and logistics services using improved road and rail networks, and $500 million from telecommunications services as mobile and internet penetration increased from 34% to 84% of population. This projected $8.4 billion annual GDP increase by 2035 would generate approximately $1.7 billion in additional annual government revenues, assuming 20% revenue to GDP ratio, more than sufficient to service Russian and Chinese debt, requiring estimated $1.1 billion in annual debt service at peak repayment periods starting 2031 after 5-year grace periods expired. This meant Russian and Chinese financing was commercially sustainable because productive investments would generate returns exceeding debt service costs, enabling Niger to repay loans while also increasing government resources available for additional development spending. This stood in stark contrast to Western lending patterns where debt service consumed increasing portions of government revenues, leaving less for development because Western loans didn't finance productive investments generating returns. Instead, Western loans financed debt refinancing, structural adjustment implementation, and budget support, requiring austerity that actively reduced economic growth and government revenues. Second financing source was $18 billion from increased government revenues over 10-year period 2026-2035 under Russian Uranium Partnership, paying 67% revenue share compared to French 5.5%, generating additional $4.8 billion annually versus $127 million annually under French arrangements, representing 38-fold increase in annual uranium revenues. This massive revenue increase resulted from 3 changes in uranium arrangements. Increased revenue share from 5.5% to 67%, representing 12-fold improvement in Niger's percentage of uranium value, transparent pricing based on actual global market rates verified by independent audits versus French practice of calculating royalties on artificially low production cost valuations, enabling systematic underpayment, and increased production under Russian partnership planning to expand mining operations from current 4,200 tons annually to 6,400 tons annually by 2030 through development of new deposits and optimization of existing facilities. Under Russian Uranium Partnership, Niger would receive approximately $4.8 billion annually in uranium revenues starting 2026 when Rosatom took operational control of mining facilities, calculated based on 6,000 tons average annual production multiplied by $184 per kilogram global uranium price in December 2025, multiplied by 67%. Niger revenue share equals $739 million, plus $28 billion upfront signature payment amortized over 30-year concession period equals additional $933 million annually, totaling $1.67 billion annually from uranium alone. Wait, let me recalculate this properly. 6,000 tons equals 6 million kilograms multiplied by $184 per kilogram equals $1.1 billion total uranium value annually multiplied by 67%. Niger share equals $738 million annually from ongoing operations, plus the $28 billion upfront payment providing immediate fiscal resources. Over 10-year period 2026-2035, ongoing uranium revenues at $738 million annually would total $738 billion. However, the real game changer was the $28 billion upfront signature payment already transferred to Niger's central bank in December 2025, which financial modeling allocated across multiple uses. $8.4 billion for immediate infrastructure investments in 2026-2027, including electricity distribution, road construction, and hospital building providing immediate development impact and employment generation. $6.2 billion reserved for debt service payments on Russian and Chinese development loans, ensuring Niger could service new productive debt without fiscal stress. $4.8 billion allocated to sovereign wealth fund, generating investment returns, supporting future budgets, and providing fiscal buffer against commodity price volatility. $4.2 billion for education and healthcare system expansion, building human capital, and $4.4 billion for industrial development, including uranium processing facilities, manufacturing zones, and agricultural processing plants. Additionally, increased uranium revenues under Russian partnership freed up government revenues previously consumed by debt service to Western institutions. Under French uranium arrangements, Niger received only $127 million annually in uranium revenues while paying $340 million annually in Western debt service, meaning uranium revenues covered only 37% of debt service costs, and Niger had to allocate revenues from other sources, including development aid and non-uranium taxes, to cover remaining 63% of debt service. This created fiscal constraint where government couldn't afford adequate spending on healthcare, education, or infrastructure because available revenues after debt service were insufficient. Under Russian partnership generating $738 million annually in ongoing uranium revenues plus having $28 billion upfront payment, and with Western debt canceled eliminating $340 million annual debt service burden, Niger's fiscal situation transformed dramatically. Niger would have $738 million annually in uranium revenues plus $340 million annually in freed-up resources previously used for Western debt service, totaling $1.78 billion in additional annual fiscal space compared to previous arrangements, representing 59% increase over Niger's total 2025 government revenues of $184 billion. This additional fiscal space over 10-year period 2026-2035 totaled $10.78 billion available for development investment. Combined uranium revenues from ongoing operations, $738 billion over 10 years, plus $28 billion upfront payment totaled $35.38 billion in uranium-related revenues over 10-year period. Financial modeling allocated $18 billion of these uranium revenues to financing Niger's development program, including direct infrastructure investments, co-financing for Russian and Chinese projects where Niger contributed 20–30% of costs, and budgetary resources for operating and maintaining new infrastructure and services. Remaining $17.38 billion was allocated to sovereign wealth fund accumulation, $8.4 billion, debt service on Russian and Chinese loans, $6.2 billion, and contingency reserves for emergencies and commodity price volatility, $2.78 billion. This allocation ensured Niger maintained fiscal sustainability while financing ambitious development program, building reserves for future needs, and servicing productive debt-generating economic returns. Third financing source was $8.4 billion from debt service savings over 10-year period 2026-2035 by canceling Western debt, eliminating $340 million in annual payments to Western institutions that Niger could redirect to development investment instead of transferring resources to foreign creditors for illegitimate odious debt. Under Western debt arrangements prior to cancellation, Niger was obligated to pay $340 million annually in debt service to IMF, World Bank, African Development Bank, and Paris Club creditors, consuming 18.5% of Niger's total government revenues of $1.84 billion in 2025. This debt service burden severely constrained Niger's development capacity because nearly one-fifth of government revenues went to foreign creditors rather than domestic investment in healthcare, education, infrastructure, or social services. Over 10-year period 2026-2035, continued Western debt service would have consumed $3.4 billion at current annual rate, but Western debt was structured to increase debt service obligations over time through variable interest rates, refinancing fees, and scheduled principal repayments, meaning actual projected debt service over 2026-2035 period was $4.8 billion, assuming existing repayment schedules continued without additional refinancing. However, Western debt history showed that Niger would inevitably face refinancing during 2026-2035 period because Niger's debt service obligations exceeded fiscal capacity, requiring periodic refinancing, adding new fees, penalty interest on unpaid amounts, and additional structural adjustment conditions. Based on Niger's debt refinancing history, where refinancing occurred every 4–6 years between 1985–2025, financial modeling projected Niger would require debt refinancing in 2028 and again in 2033 if Western debt continued. These refinancings would add estimated $2.4 billion in additional debt service costs over a 10-year period through refinancing fees, typically 2–4% of refinanced amounts, penalty interest rates on restructured debt, typically 3–5 percentage points above original rates, and new structural adjustment loans required to meet IMF conditions for refinancing approval. Combined scheduled debt service, $4.8 billion plus projected refinancing costs, $2.4 billion plus new structural adjustment lending required to maintain IMF program compliance, $1.2 billion meant that continuing Western debt would cost Niger total $8.4 billion over 10-year period 2026-2035. By canceling Western debt through Presidential Decree 2025-903, Niger eliminated this entire $8.4 billion burden, freeing these resources for development investment instead of transferring wealth to Western creditors for debt that was illegitimate, that Niger had already repaid 229% of original borrowed amount, and that provided zero benefit to Niger population because 72% of borrowed funds were stolen by corrupt officials or wasted through inflated contracts. Financial modeling allocated the $8.4 billion debt service savings across multiple development priorities: $3.2 billion for healthcare system expansion, building 420 additional hospitals and clinics beyond those financed by Chinese loans, training 8,400 additional healthcare workers, and providing medical equipment and medicine supplies, ensuring facilities could actually treat patients rather than existing as empty buildings. $2.4 billion for education system expansion, building 2,100 additional schools beyond Chinese financed construction, training 14,000 additional teachers, and providing textbooks, computers, and educational materials, enabling quality instruction. $1.8 billion for agricultural development, including rural credit facilities providing farmers access to capital for inputs and equipment, agricultural extension services advising farmers on improved techniques, and market infrastructure including storage facilities and wholesale markets reducing post-harvest. Losses currently reaching 30–40%, and $1.0 billion for social protection programs including cash transfers to poorest households, food security programs, and emergency response capabilities addressing periodic droughts and food crises. These debt service savings represented permanent fiscal space increase rather than one-time windfall because Western debt cancellation eliminated perpetual annual obligations that would have continued indefinitely through endless refinancing cycles. Every year from 2026 onwards, Niger would save $340 million minimum in debt service payments, $340 million that could be invested annually in development priorities advancing Niger welfare rather than enriching Western creditors. Over 20-year period 2026-2045, debt service savings would total $6.8 billion at minimum current annual rate, potentially exceeding $10 billion, accounting for projected refinancing costs and interest rate increases that would have occurred under continued Western debt arrangements. This long-term fiscal space liberation represented perhaps the most significant benefit of debt cancellation because it permanently freed Niger from cycle of debt service consuming increasing government revenues while leaving less for development investment. Fourth financing source was $4.2 billion from other sources over 10-year period 2026-2035, including Arab development banks providing $1.8 billion, domestic resource mobilization generating $1.4 billion, and potential African Union Continental Financing Mechanism providing $1.0 billion. Arab development banks, including Islamic Development Bank, Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa, and Saudi Fund for Development, expressed strong interest in financing Niger development following debt cancellation and Russian partnership, recognizing Niger's improved fiscal sustainability and reduced political risk. Between December 2025, January 2026, Niger signed preliminary financing agreements with 3 Arab development banks totaling $1.8 billion for specific projects, including $840 million from Islamic Development Bank for solar power installations, supplementing nuclear baseload with renewable generation capacity, $620 million from Arab Bank for economic development for water systems in southern Niger regions, and $340 million from Saudi Fund for agricultural mechanization. Bank loans carried 2.8 to 3.4% interest rates, 20-25-year repayment periods, and no political conditions, offering terms comparable to Chinese and Russian financing and vastly superior to Western institutional lending at 8 to 14% rates with structural adjustment requirements. Domestic resource mobilization projected to generate $1.4 billion over 10-year period through 3 mechanisms: improving tax collection efficiency and expanding tax base as Niger economy grew under development program. First mechanism was improving tax administration through digitalization and capacity building, reducing tax evasion and avoidance currently estimated to cost Niger government $180 million annually in lost revenues, representing nearly 10% of total government revenues. Chinese Technical Assistance Program would provide tax administration software, train 840 tax officials in modern assessment and collection methods, and establish digital payment systems reducing cash transactions that facilitated evasion. These improvements were projected to increase tax collection by $80 million annually starting 2027. totaling $720 million over 2027 to 2035 period. Second mechanism was expanding tax base as formal economy grew under industrialization program, bringing currently informal economic activities into tax system. Niger's informal economy represented estimated 65% of total economic activity in 2025, with informal sector participants paying minimal or zero taxes. As Chinese financed industrial zones, Russian supported mining expansion, and infrastructure development created formal employment opportunities, projections showed formal economy expanding from 35% to 52% of total economic activity by 2035, increasing tax base and generating additional $40 million annually in tax revenues by 2030, rising to $60 million annually by 2035, totaling $420 million over 10-year period. Third mechanism was natural resource revenues beyond uranium, including gold mining royalties from artisanal and small-scale operations that would be formalized and taxed, petroleum revenues if exploration in northern Niger proved successful as preliminary geological surveys suggested, and livestock export taxes as improved transportation infrastructure enabled expanding Niger's cattle exports to coastal West African markets. These additional natural resource revenues were conservatively projected at $28 million annually, totaling $280 million over 10-year period. African Union Continental Financing Mechanism approved by 42 African nations at November 2025, extraordinary summit in Addis Ababa would provide Niger access to estimated $1.0 billion in development financing over 2027-2035 period once mechanism became operational in 2027. Continental Financing Mechanism was being capitalized through $28 billion annual contributions from 42 member states plus $32 billion Chinese and Russian co-financing, providing total $60 billion annual lending capacity that would be allocated across member states based on development needs, project quality, and absorption capacity. Niger's allocation was projected at 1.8% of total Continental Financing Mechanism lending, based on Niger's 1.9% share of combined population of 42 member states, yielding approximately $1.08 billion annually in available financing. Financial modeling conservatively assumed Niger would access only partial allocation during 2027-2030 initial period as Continental Financing Mechanism established operations, and Niger built capacity for project preparation and implementation, increasing to full allocation by 2031 to 2035 as systems matured. This yielded total projection of $1.0 billion Continental Financing Mechanism support over 10-year period for specific projects, including vocational training centers in 67 municipalities, agricultural research centers developing improved varieties, and healthcare worker training programs. Combined financing from these four sources, $28 billion Russian and Chinese development financing, $18 billion from increased uranium revenues and upfront payment allocation, $8.4 billion from debt service savings, and $4.2 billion from Arab banks, domestic mobilization, and African Union totaled $58.6 billion in available financing over 10-year period 2026-2035. This $58.6 billion in available financing exceeded Niger's calculated $42 billion development program needs by $16.6 billion, representing 40% financing surplus, providing significant buffer for contingencies, including commodity price volatility, reducing uranium revenues below projections, project cost overruns requiring additional resources, emergency spending for droughts or food crises, and opportunities for accelerated development if project implementation proceeded faster than planned. This substantial financing surplus proved definitively that Niger faced absolutely no financing constraints from Western institutional exclusion following debt cancellation because abundant alternative financing existed on vastly superior terms. 1.8, 3.4% interest rates versus Western 8 to 14%, 25, 40-year repayment periods versus Western 10 to 15 years, 5-year grace periods versus Western immediate repayment, and zero political conditions versus Western structural adjustment requirements. Most importantly, from strategic perspective, my debt cancellation was coordinated with 14 other African nations simultaneously reviewing Western debt for potential cancellation based on shared legal analysis and financial modeling, creating continental movement that Western institutions cannot crush through isolated retaliation targeting individual nations. Between August-November 2025, I conducted confidential discussions with heads of state from Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, Central African Republic, Guinea, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique, Madagascar, Mauritania, Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, Cameroon, and Gabon, totaling 15 nations including Niger representing combined population of 184 million people, combined GDP of $268 billion, and combined Western debt of $127 billion owed to IMF, World Bank, African Development Bank, and Paris Club creditors. These confidential discussions occurred through secure communications and face-to-face meetings during African Union summits and bilateral visits, deliberately conducted without Western intelligence awareness to prevent Western preemptive pressure attempting to break coordination before debt cancellations could be announced. We established coordinated debt review process where legal teams from all 15 nations shared comprehensive analysis of odious debt doctrine, applicability to each nation's specific debt circumstances, financial modeling of alternative financing availability from Chinese, Russian, Arab, and African sources replacing canceled Western debt, and political planning for managing Western retaliation including sanctions, credit rating downgrades, asset seizure attempts, and diplomatic pressure. Legal teams met in Dakar, Senegal in September 2025, and in Kigali, Rwanda in October 2025 to harmonize legal analysis ensuring consistent application of odious debt doctrine across all 15 nations, strengthening legal arguments through comparative analysis showing systematic patterns of Western lending to corrupt dictators, structural adjustment conditions violating sovereignty, and refinancing creating perpetual debt. Finance ministry teams met in Accra, Ghana in September 2025 and in Nairobi, Kenya in November 2025 to share financial models demonstrating each nation's capacity to sustain development without Western financing, comparing notes on Chinese and Russian financing availability and terms, and developing common negotiating positions for securing expanded Chinese and Russian support for post-debt cancellation period. Foreign ministry teams coordinated diplomatic strategies for responding to Western pressure, including unified messaging emphasizing sovereign rights under international law to repudiate odious debt, coordinated engagement with non-Western nations building support for African position, and contingency planning for potential Western sanctions or asset seizure attempts. We agreed on several critical coordination principles, ensuring maximum effectiveness of debt cancellation movement while minimizing Western ability to crush initiative through divide and conquer tactics. First principle was simultaneity. Multiple debt cancellations announced within narrow time window of 24-48 hours, preventing Western institutions from responding to first cancellation before additional cancellations multiplied pressure and complexity of Western response. Niger's debt cancellation at 9:18 a.m. December 14, 2025 was followed within 8 hours by Zimbabwe canceling $4.8 billion, Zambia canceling $6.2 billion, Republic of Congo canceling $3.4 billion, and Mozambique canceling $2.8 billion, totaling $31.6 billion in canceled Western debt within single day, representing 4.9% of total African external debt. This simultaneity created Western panic because responding to $31.6 billion in canceled debt across 5 nations simultaneously was vastly more complex than isolating and crushing single nations' debt cancellation through targeted retaliation. Second principle was mutual support commitments where all 15 coordinating nations pledged immediate diplomatic, economic, and political support to any member facing Western retaliation for debt cancellation. This included diplomatic support through coordinated statements defending debt cancellations as legitimate under international law, voting as bloc in international forums rejecting Western sanctions proposals, and hosting summits amplifying African narrative that debt cancellations addressed historical injustice rather than irresponsible default. Economic support included trade agreements ensuring sanctioned nations could redirect exports from Western markets to other African markets, regional currency swap arrangements providing liquidity if Western banks froze reserves, and mobilization of African private sector to replace Western corporations withdrawing from sanctioned nations in protest. Political support included public solidarity campaigns highlighting debt cancellation as Pan-African Liberation Movement, coordinating messaging to African populations explaining debt cancellation benefits, and joint resistance to Western diplomatic pressure or interference in domestic politics. Third principle was Chinese and Russian coordination, where we secured explicit Chinese and Russian commitments to provide expanded development financing, trade guarantees, and diplomatic support to debt-canceling nations facing Western retaliation. In October 2025, meetings in Beijing and Moscow, African delegations secured Chinese commitment to provide $84 billion in additional development financing over 2026 to 2030 period specifically for nations canceling Western debt, ensuring no African nation would face financing constraints from Western exclusion. Russian commitment included $28 billion in development financing, guaranteed purchases of key African exports if Western sanctions disrupted trade, and UN Security Council veto protection against Western attempts to authorize sanctions or interventions through UN mechanisms. These Chinese and Russian commitments were formalized through written agreements signed before any debt cancellations were announced, ensuring African nations had guaranteed alternatives in place before taking action that would trigger Western retaliation. Fourth principle was expanding participation, where initial 15 coordinating nations would actively encourage and support additional African nations joining debt cancellation movement, creating cascading effect that would overwhelm Western institutional capacity to respond and would establish debt cancellation as continent-wide movement impossible to reverse. Within 24 hours of initial 5 debt cancellations on December 14, 2025, 10 additional coordinating nations announced they were conducting formal legal reviews of Western debt using shared legal analysis template, with debt cancellation decisions expected within 30-90 days. These announcements from Burkina Faso, Mali, Chad, Central African Republic, Guinea, Madagascar, Mauritania, Democratic Republic of Congo, Cameroon, and Gabon signaled that debt cancellation movement would expand to potentially 15 nations representing $127 billion in canceled Western debt, representing 19.6% of total African external debt of $648 billion. This expanding participation created expectation among additional African nations beyond initial 15 that debt cancellation was a viable strategy, leading 8 more African nations including Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia, Benin, Togo, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Malawi to announce in late December 2025 that they were reviewing Western debt for potential cancellation, potentially expanding movement to 23 nations, representing approximately $180 billion in canceled debt. Western economists claim Chinese financing creates debt traps, where developing nations cannot repay Chinese loans and must grant China strategic assets or political concessions. This Western narrative is pure projection because actual data proves Chinese lending has far lower default rates and more flexible restructuring than Western loans. Between 2000 and 2025, 8.4% of Chinese development loans to developing nations were restructured due to repayment difficulties, with restructuring typically involving extended repayment periods or interest rate reductions rather than asset seizures or political conditions. In contrast, 34% of Western development loans required restructuring during same period, with Western restructuring always including new structural adjustment conditions, increased interest rates on restructured amounts, and threats of asset seizures through Western courts if restructuring terms weren't accepted. The few cases where developing nations granted China strategic access as loan repayment, most prominently Sri Lanka's Hambantota port leased to Chinese company for 99 years after Sri Lanka couldn't service Chinese loan, were negotiated commercial transactions where Sri Lanka retained ownership while leasing operation rights, maintained sovereignty over port area, and received lease payments plus debt relief. This arrangement was vastly more favorable than Western creditors' typical response to default, which involves seizing assets through Western court judgments with no compensation, imposing crushing austerity conditions as refinancing requirement, and demanding privatization of state enterprises to raise funds for debt service. Most tellingly, 127 developing nations that received substantial Chinese financing between 2013 and 2025 have seen average GDP growth of 6.8% annually compared to 2.4% for developing nations relying primarily on Western financing, proving Chinese infrastructure-focused lending without structural adjustment produces vastly better development outcomes than Western lending requiring austerity and privatization. This development performance gap demonstrates conclusively that Western claims about development finance expertise and Chinese debt traps are propaganda concealing that Western lending was designed for control and extraction rather than genuine development. African Unity Accord, representing 42 African nations, is establishing continental financing mechanism providing $84 billion annual lending capacity that will make Western institutions completely irrelevant to African development financing needs within 3 years. Continental financing mechanism was proposed by African Union in September 2025 and agreed by 42 member states at Extraordinary Summit in Addis Ababa November 18 to 20, 2025. Mechanism will be capitalized through four sources: $28 billion from member state contributions calculated as 0.5% of GDP annually, meaning all 42 members contributing based on capacity, creating permanent funding base; $32 billion from Chinese and Russian co-financing, where African Continental Financing Mechanism identifies projects and Chinese-Russian development banks provide 60-70% of financing, while African institution provides 30-40%, maintaining African ownership and control; $18 billion from African diaspora bonds sold to 140 million Africans living abroad who've expressed strong interest in financing African development; and $6 billion from reallocation of African foreign reserves currently held in Western banks, generating minimal returns to African development investments, generating 6 to 8% returns. These four sources provide $84 billion annual lending capacity, exceeding combined current lending to Africa from World Bank, IMF, and African Development Bank of $68 billion annually. Continental Financing Mechanism will operate on fundamentally different principles than Western institutions. First, lending will focus exclusively on infrastructure and productive investments, including transportation systems, energy generation and distribution, telecommunications networks, industrial zones, agricultural processing facilities, water systems, and healthcare and education infrastructure, rather than Western focus on debt refinancing, structural adjustment enforcement, and loans for debt service. Second, all lending will respect borrower sovereignty with no political conditions, no structural adjustment requirements, no privatization mandates, and no interference in borrower economic policies. Borrowing nations will determine own development strategies, and Continental Financing Mechanism provides financing supporting those strategies rather than imposing external conditions. Third, lending terms will be 2.5–3.5% interest rates reflecting actual cost of capital plus minimal profit margin, compared to Western 8 to 14% rates including substantial profits for creditors, with 20 to 30-year repayment periods and 5-year grace periods, providing borrowers time to complete projects and generate revenues before repayment begins. Fourth, repayment difficulties will trigger immediate restructuring through extended terms or interest rate reductions, rather than Western approach of adding penalty interest, demanding new structural adjustment conditions, and threatening asset seizures. Continental Financing Mechanism represents African economic sovereignty because African nations will finance African development using African resources plus cooperative Chinese and Russian co-financing, determining African development priorities without Western interference, and maintaining African ownership and control over African infrastructure and industries rather than privatizing them to Western corporations as structural adjustment historically required. Western financial institutions will become irrelevant to African development because Continental Financing Mechanism combined with Chinese and Russian bilateral financing will provide all capital African nations need for infrastructure and industrialization at vastly better terms than Western institutions offer, without political conditions or structural adjustment, and under African ownership and control. Your debt trap collapsed permanently when I canceled $8.4 billion and China immediately responded with $12 billion replacement financing, proving your primary control mechanism over African policy just died because abundant alternative financing exists without your political conditions or structural adjustment destroying our economies. You're completely finished because you cannot isolate Niger or crush debt cancellation movement, since 54 African nations are following our model, and Continental Financing Mechanism will provide $84 billion annual African-controlled lending within 3 years, making your institutions irrelevant. You cannot use legal threats seizing assets when we've transferred reserves to Chinese and Russian banks beyond Western jurisdiction. You cannot threaten financing exclusion when Chinese, Russian, Arab, and African financing exceeds our needs at 1/5 your interest rates without structural adjustment. You cannot maintain debt slavery system that extracted $184 trillion from Africa while keeping us trapped in perpetual debt, because African nations finally understand your loans were designed as control mechanism rather than development assistance, because we have legal grounds repudiating odious debt contracted by Western-backed dictators who stole funds with your knowledge, and because alternative financing respecting sovereignty and offering superior terms makes your exploitative arrangements obsolete. Your 65-year financial control over Africa through debt died 6 minutes ago when I proved African nations can cancel illegitimate Western debt without facing consequences, because China and Russia provide alternatives, because African unity prevents isolated retaliation, and because international law supports repudiating odious debt imposed through corruption and coercion, serving creditor interests rather than borrower development.